Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Leading Voices, our conversation with top University of the Pacific alumni. Today, we are honored to welcome back to Pacific Steve Goulart, class of 1980, and former member of our Board of Regents. As you just heard, Mr. Goulart has had an extraordinary career in investment banking. Today, he is Executive Vice President and Chief Investment Officer of Metlife, and is on the board of the Tri-County Scholarship Fund, the Augustine Institute, and the Metlife Foundation. Steve, welcome back to Pacific.
Well, thanks so much for having me, President Callahan, and welcome yourself. I mean, this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to chat and meet, and these are interesting times, so welcome.
Thank you so much, Steve. We've been here for 4 months now, and it feels like longer. I will say that. Interesting, as you say, interesting times. Let's start off at Pacific. Let's go back to your days here at the university. Can you talk a little bit about how your Pacific education helped prepare you for your future and the great career that came?
Yeah, well, I have to admit, in that little video clip, there was something there that was very meaningful to me at the time, and really is growing up through high school and the like. And my parents really were committed to ensure that I went to college. Now, my view on it was, hey, I'm going to college to play football. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. And luckily, the two were able to be married together. But my parents were insistent that I was going to go to college. And so I have to thank them, for never letting go of that goal for me. Because, again, it was football that ultimately attracted me to Pacific, the opportunity to play there. And once I was there and got in, I realized there was a lot more to be thinking about. By the time I was a junior, it was clear to me I wasn't going to be an NFL player, as much as I thought that was my real career goal and aspiration. And throughout that time, I had the right sort of contacts and advisors through the school, and really started paying attention to what did I want to do for the long term. And so when I think about it, there were a lot of things that really I was able to benefit from the Pacific. I mentioned one, just the ability to make those close contacts across the faculty and advisors and everyone else. Certainly, I look at my faculty advisor, Don Bryan, as being one who was very instrumental. I talked a lot about Dante Scarnecchia, my position coach on the football team. But there are others I think about the Career Center and other professors outside of business who really were always available too. So I think being able to take advantage of the resources that existed were very instrumental in that. And I think as you really sort of realize it, I have to prepare myself for the world out there. You start taking advantage of what there is. So sort of the independence to learn, the ability to build those contacts. The other thing, I had a couple of great internships while I was there that introduced me to the business world as well. And then it was really sort of about figuring out where I wanted to go after college.
Well, thank you, because you hit on so many of the themes that we think are still vital to the Pacific experience, and that individualized learning and those relationships between student and faculty. Are there folks from your Pacific days that you still keep in contact with?
Yeah, well, until a couple of years ago, I was still in contact with Don Bryan, my faculty advisor. I know he retired a number of years ago, but and I'm also still in fairly close contact with Dante Scarnecchia, who just retired the second time from the New England Patriots, a couple of years ago. But he and I, see each other still. Well, we saw each other all the time when he was still coaching, because luckily, if you're working at MetLife, somehow you get tickets to MetLife Stadium. So I got to go to football games and always managed to see the Patriots when they were in town. And Dante and I would always get together after the games. So certainly staying in contact. And then as far as the students go, I still am in contact with a number of certainly my former teammates, my former fraternity brothers, and other friends throughout. In fact, one of my longest time friends is another well-known alumni, Rick Paulson. Rick and I played Little League baseball together, believe it or not. That's how long we've known each other, and it's great to still have that kind of relationship.
That's marvelous. And and another another kind of relationship. As I talk to alums from around the country and really around the world, I'm just struck by how many married couples first met at Pacific. And I know you and Christy first met. Can you share the story of the first time that you met Christy?
Well, that's always dangerous because sometimes, spouses have different recollections of that first meeting, but we actually generally agree on the circumstances. But I still remember very clearly, I was in my room in my fraternity, and she had come over to actually visit one of her good friends who was a fraternity brother. They went to junior college together, and he happened to live next door to me and happened not to be home when she was knocking on the door. And so I opened the door to see, and I introduced myself to her. And that was the start of something. It took me a few days to get the courage to ask her to go out. We still remember our first date. She brought her roommate along, of course, to ensure that everything was fine. But it was at the Baskin-Robbins down on Pacific Avenue. So whenever we're home, we make a point of going to visit Baskin-Robbins for an ice cream. And in fact, I can't tell you the number of times we've taken our daughters with us to relive that first date, and it's great fun. And I will say also, that video was, I'll admit that video was recorded, for the Alumni Awards banquet a year and a half ago. We actually just celebrated our 40th anniversary, and obviously are very lucky and very pleased.
Marvelous. Well, congratulations. And I have to ask, were the girls patient with you when you and Christy took them back to the Baskin-Robbins, or was there a lot of eye rolling?
No, they loved it. They loved it. They want to understand, how mom and dad met. They want to know all the circumstances, and especially one, our youngest daughter, she will really drill down just to sort of compare our stories. She's the one that realizes that there's something not quite there, but it's fun, and they really do. They enjoy it too. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So Steve, we as you know, we have a lot of students from your old school, the Eberhard School of Business, here with us today. And they're starting to think about their careers. And as they're getting started, what advice would you have for them, particularly at this stage, as they're transitioning from college into the professional world? What kind of advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I think it's important. These are, your early stages in your career are important, not necessarily because you're going to be at that job for your entire career or even that company. Look at my own career. I've now worked at, I think it's six different companies, but a very different range of jobs too. So to me, what's important, and I give this advice to a lot of, the new people starting at MetLife in the investments area and throughout the company too. I think there are several things that are important as you embark on your career. The first thing is have curiosity. Really be curious about what you do, about how your job relates to the rest of the company, about how the company relates to the world of commerce, the competitors, how the business environment works. People notice that curiosity. So I think that's always good. And number two, I think, is to really sort of start establishing a network, make contacts, make contacts within the firm, make contacts across different areas of the firm, make contacts outside of the firm. There are a lot of your college classmates that will start at different firms. So continue those networks, continue to build, because you're all able to educate each other and inform each other about, developments and the like. And I think the final thing I'd say is be proactive. Don't just assume that things are going to happen to you in your career. You have to take ownership of your career too. Now, that though, I will say, for a long time, I used to always hear about, in fact, I had myself the 5-year plan, right? What are the next 5 years going to be for my career? That's very important. I've got to map that out. Well, I can tell you, I probably had, 15 5-year plans over the course of my career, and not one of them actually played out the way that I expected them to. So that's probably the final lesson, which is be flexible. I mean, expect the unexpected and be ready to take opportunities you might not have expected.
Great. Speaking of the unexpected, Steve, our students today have been, thrown a real challenge, being in college at the time of COVID-19. And I'm wondering, and I will tell you, they've been doing a fantastic job. They have dug in. They are doing great work. They're continuing their learning in fantastic ways. But obviously, it's challenging. And I'm wondering, given a challenge that you and I never faced when we were in college and haven't faced until now, Any particular advice you would have for our students in how they can navigate professionally, academic, or even sort of psychologically, if you will, the COVID obstacles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I point to a couple of the things that I mentioned just in general advice. One is, being proactive in this, because I think, it's easy in a virtual environment just to sort of be on the other side of the camera. But again, I think that's why it's even more important to be proactive in this. In the learning environment, I'm certain that the faculty at Pacific is still just as available. It's probably by phone now or Zoom meeting rather than in person, but still take advantage of it. My own view is I think this has got to be a much harder learning environment on this basis. So I think it's really sort of incumbent on you to really try and be proactive as you can. I suspect that the availability of assistance, the availability of guidance is still there. I can't imagine the professors don't want to see all of you succeed. And so, really just sort of reach out in this environment that we're in and continue to try and take as much advantage of the services, of the availability, of the interaction that is there.
Well, that's really great advice, Steve. And I will tell you, our faculty members, not only are they just as available, in some ways they're even more available because they're so concerned about the continuation of the learning for our students that they are making themselves available almost literally around the clock. So I think that's great advice for all of our students. Many are taking advantage of that. We hope all of them do, because again, that's one of the great assets of being here at Pacific.
Yeah.
So, Steve, great leaders oftentimes have very different leadership styles from each other. If you could, how would you describe your own leadership style? And do you think that there are certain elements that are common to all great leaders?
Yeah, I think that there's a long list of characteristics if you compiled every leader's characteristics. So it's hard to find, I think, two that are probably identical. But there certainly are, pools of characteristics that are common across them. And when I think about myself and my own leadership style, I think about, where I am. In fact, I still remember the day that our CEO at Metlife came to me and said, "I want to make you the next chief investment officer." And I said, "Wow, I've spent 4 months of my career in investments, and you want to make me CIO? There's something, I'm missing something there, aren't I?" And he said, "No, there isn't, because when you think about the job as a leader, it's a lot more than just a technical proficiency in the area that you're leading or managing. And so it really does come to how do you manage and how do you lead people." And so, and I reflect a lot on, my own style in doing that, how I, sort of progress to where I am, and think a lot about it today because, one of my primary jobs now is really preparing the next group of leaders. I'm going to retire sometime in the next, 2 to 3 years, and we've got to be ready to have somebody move into that. So I spend a lot of time thinking about making sure that there are good people to choose as my successor. Who are the leaders going to be? And so when I think about myself, though, what is always what's been most important to me is really surrounding myself with strong people. I've never felt threatened by anybody that works for me. And my view is if there's somebody that's better than me for this job, then they should be in this job. And I'm never going to stand in the way. And I've always felt that throughout my career. So that means I want strong people around me. But most importantly is I also want to build people that have a diversity of skills and a diversity of views, because and the diversity of even backgrounds. That's really important because I think to be a real effective leader, you have to be able to consider so much in today's world, so many different views, so many different opinions, so many different possibilities. And I think so to me, surrounding myself with strong leaders who have very diverse views and backgrounds allows me to sort of hear a multitude of opportunities and alternatives. And from there, I work through it with my team a lot of times it comes down to me having to make that final call, of course. But I feel like when I've gotten a full range of view from a diverse group of people, that I have all of the tools and all of the information necessary to make that. So that's really how I kind of manage and lead my business. I think other things that are important though throughout it is, I mentioned the same things that started out in my career that I thought were important too. Curiosity, even to this day. I'm always asking questions, something I don't understand. And by the way, that's the first thing is honesty and admitting you don't understand something. And I'm not afraid to ask, my people, something happened in the market. Why? Something happened with some development with a new product we might be trying to roll out. Those sorts of things. It's really, I think, incumbent, on a leader to have the honesty. And then finally, it's also transparency. Now, as I've said to people, there's always a limit to transparency because I can't tell my direct reports everything that's going on. I can't tell every word of the conversation I just had with the CEO or at the executive group level. But transparency and communicating everything that you can gives everybody the sense that they understand the mission, they understand the path forward, they all buy into it because we're all sharing from the same set of information. I think those are three criteria that I think about a lot. And
yeah, I think that's tremendously helpful. Thank you. I could be selfish and just keep on asking you questions all afternoon, but I want to turn this over to our students and other guests. And Chris Ortega is going to guide us through some student questions. So Chris, let me hand it off to you.
Yes, all right. So for everyone who is here with us today, if you use the raise hand option, we already have one person. And so underneath the participants tab, there will be a hand raise option. And so for our first question, Christian Murphy, class of 21, go ahead and unmute yourself and we will have you ask your question.
I just want to say thank you, first of all, for taking the time to talk with us today. And then my question is, as a college athlete, how has that, your experience as a collegiate athlete shaped your career in the business world?
Yeah, great question. I love talking about my time playing football and what it meant. And I think it's not just football; it's all athletics because I think. And by the way, it can also be expanded beyond athletics to really sort of a range of extracurricular activities. But for me particularly, football meant several things. Number one is it really instills discipline in a number of ways. Number one, of course, you've got the discipline to be a collegiate athlete, and what that takes as far as working out, as far as learning, game plans, the whole 9 yards there too. So there's just the standalone discipline as part of a college athlete, but then marry that into also being a full-time student, and so the discipline really of learning time management. I still remember. One time when I was fairly sick, I was at practice. Ultimately, my coach, who I mentioned, Dante Scarnecchi, he said, "Look, go home, get some rest. Take off the last half hour of practice and go." So I did. I left. Well, I also realized when I got back to my room that night that, oh my gosh, I have an exam tomorrow, and I really need to spend more time. And, maybe unlike a lot of people, I actually preferred to go study in the library just because it gave me sort of the solitude. And so I actually did. So I had gone to the library, and lo and behold, Coach Scarnecchia came over to check on me after practice when I'm not there. So then somebody told him I was in the library, and he actually did come find me. So, but anyway, it teaches you discipline in that respect too, time management. There's so many demands on your time that it really requires you to be able to figure that out. The other thing is, I think, certainly from my perspective, I've always thought about it just as the responsibility it builds in you, particularly when you're part of a team like I was, one of the 5-member offensive line, and of course our integration into the rest of the offense, but the responsibility you had to others too, because if I screwed up, it didn't just usually mean me, it meant something else went wrong too. So I had a responsibility to all of my teammates to always ensure that I was doing the right thing. And that, I mean, again, I think, it got to the point where I was more concerned about letting my teammates down than myself. And I think that's the other aspect of it too, is just teamwork. I think, even in the business world, yes, we're all, growing our own careers, but it's almost impossible to do it on your own. I mean, and that's what I talked about networking. It's about building those support systems around you, about becoming part of a team, understanding how you interact as part of a team. I couldn't have gotten anywhere in my career if I were, really just trying to be sort of a sole operator in it. You have to be a part of a team. And I think learning those sorts of lessons along the way are incredibly valuable. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
All right. And next up, we have Kelvin, class of 20. And so go ahead and unmute yourself, and we will have you spotlighted.
Hi, Mr. Goulart. First, I want to say thank you for taking the time to sit down with us today. So I'm currently the CIO for the Eberhard Student Investment Fund. And so I was just wondering, what do you think is the best thing that I can do in this CIO role to help better improve the fund overall?
That's a great question. By the way, I'm sorry I haven't been able to visit with the fund, but I have tried, every time I'm in Stockton, but I'm sure you're all working virtually today anyway. And maybe you can give me some advice on what's going on in the market, because, the last few days have been pretty ugly, but that's another story, because I can talk about how we invest at MetLife. And I usually try and give this lesson when I meet with the student investment fund. We're basically a fixed income investor. We have very little in the way of equity investments in our portfolio. And a lot of that has to do with the liabilities that we are trying to ensure that we can pay off. So we really need fixed income investments. But I think, going back to your role and how you can improve the fund, again, I would go to some of the things that I pointed out when President Callahan was asking me, some of my lessons and the like. And I think one is, don't depend on yourself to have to do it all. And I think your role actually is, sort of a combination of, yes, you probably ultimately are responsible for the final decision. And that actually, does come to me. It doesn't come to me on every trade, because that's what we push responsibility down for. But sort of a big strategic shift, out of one sector into another sector, or, from one asset class to a different asset class, or preparing for a recession, possible recession or downturn, those sorts of things. Those are the kinds of decisions that come to you. But in absence of that, again, surround yourself with good people and make sure that, you're getting views that reflect a sort of a full range of alternatives, so that you can, as a team, work through those alternatives and really come up with the best solution. That's what I would say. And part of, so part of it, you're always dealing with, either a combination of limited resources, limited time, limited money perhaps, and the like. So you also have to always be able to kind of prepare or define your universe. Know what are the alternatives that are in play, what are the alternatives that are out of play, and don't waste time assessing or analyzing something that can't happen or isn't going to happen anyway. Focus really on the things that are going to drive, the most important decisions, the biggest outcomes for what you're going to do. So those are some thoughts. Hopefully that helps.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, great question so far. Next up, we have Mark, class of 20.
Hey, Steve. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I guess my question isn't really like anything technical. It was just like more so, having dreams of going to the NFL and, being a kid from here, Stockton. Did you ever visualize yourself in this role today?
And until 9 years ago, no. No. And it's interesting, I think, again, that's part of when you start your career, what I talked about is, having that curiosity, being proactive about what you want to do. Now, I will say, as I think about the early stages of my life post-Pacific, I had made some determinations. For instance, believe it or not, the criteria for how I picked my first job, I went to work for Bechtel Power Corporation, was who would move me the furthest. And that sounds silly, but I'd spent my entire life in Stockton. I knew I wanted to, sort of broaden my horizons. And part of that I thought was going to be moving somewhere else. I knew I wanted to work in finance, which frankly wasn't exactly what I did at Bechtel. But ultimately, that I did want to work in finance. I'd started understanding a little bit about Wall Street, but not very much. So I knew that I could broaden my horizons by really just relocating myself somewhere entirely different than where I'd spent my entire life. So that was important. And also at the time, I knew I was committed to going and getting my MBA. And I also knew that most of the schools I was looking at required some work experience. So I sort of viewed it as this is a great opportunity just to gain broad experience, grow as an individual person, somewhere by being somewhere different than having to, start building your own independence basically instead of relying on the same support system you had, to that point in time. So I knew I was sort of on a path. Ultimately, when I got into Harvard, it certainly started gelling on that path of getting into Wall Street, taking me to the East Coast, giving me the education, giving me that network that was so important. And so I was able to, ultimately, I'll say this, I never had the exact job while I was an investment banker that I had wanted 3 years prior. But it was still, sort of it continued on the path that I really enjoyed, the ability to learn and continue to grow. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but the short answer was no. I had no idea. I mean, if you'd asked me the day I graduated from Pacific, would I expect to have been someday the chief investment officer for MetLife? I said, you're crazy. But that's, I think it's really about, being open and having, like I said, the curiosity, the ability to network, and the ability to accept the unexpected. I mean, I can think about, probably at least 3 or 4 specific times in my career where, a manager or somebody came to me and with something I had, very little expectation would be on the table, and it was on the table. So just, be prepared.
Most definitely.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Excellent. And next up, Gil Relion. So go ahead.
Steve, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Great to hear from you.
Yeah. Hey, over your career, are there any books that helped influence your development post-Pacific? And what are you reading now?
So the first thing I'll admit to is I have several stacks of books that are probably each about 5 feet high, and they're the books I'm going to read.
Me too.
I will say that. So there was a time, and this is kind of a funny story. There was a time, kind of midstream in my investment banking career, where all I wanted to read was fiction. I wanted things to just take my mind off work, and that's something else that's important. Is you have to be able to really sort of get away from what you're doing. And I still remember my neighbors used to tease me all the time that I'd be walking home from the train station to my house, which is only about 3/4 of a mile, and so I'd walk it whenever the weather allowed. Walking and reading the latest John Grisham novel.
Yeah.
So I went through plenty of those. As far as business books go, literally, I've got a stack of books also, and I can't say that there was one book when I moved into investments about, and I'll forget the author's name, but it was basically The First 90 Days is the title of the book. And it really helped me think about how I moved into this entirely new job for me, what I should be thinking about, how I should prepare, and how I should go about assessing the situation. And that was invaluable because I did use that. I came up with a framework for how to think about it, because it was interesting because it was a job that was in transition. We just done a big acquisition, so things were changing anyway. And 90 days later, I went back to my boss and said, here's how I'm assessing the situation. Here's where I think we should go with this, that. And again, that was, probably the first exercise that ultimately allowed, he ultimately became CEO and made me CIO. So that was it. The first 90 days, I think that was really critical. And then, there may be a lot of people are going to sort of poo-poo me on this, but the book I read now and I read constantly is the Bible. And it's incredible how much advice you get by reading the Bible. What I actually do now is when I see something that really writes, I'll write it down and I stick it on my computer. There's a collection, a book called Bible in a Year. And what that does is essentially it gives you 3 readings a day, and it splits up the Old Testament, the New Testament, and a Psalm or Proverb or something. But it's incredible how it takes you in 1 year, you read the entire Bible, and it takes you through it with lessons along the way. And again, there are so many lessons that I think about that and things that, I recall. And, and I still think in the business context, strict business context, one of my favorites is, it's better to be criticized by a wise person than praised by a fool. And that's just so applicable to everything we do.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Gil. Great seeing you.
Wonderful. And next up, Mary Piatanza, class of '86.
Hi, Steve. Nice to see you again. Thank you for participating in this session. These are always really fun and informative. I have a 2-part question for you. The first part is, thinking back on your career, what would you say was your greatest challenge, and what strengths did you pull to overcome those? So what were those things that you did or used to overcome that challenge? And the second part is, what would you say has been most fulfilling in your career and why?
On the challenging part, there are several. There isn't one thing that I say, oh, that was the moment. Yeah. But I look and I see 3 or 4 things at various points in my career where there was a critical decision I had to make, a critical thing I had to do, and how I made it. And I'll tell you this. This might sound strange, but probably the hardest decision I ever had to make was when I decided to leave investment banking. And it was because, if you put it in the context, I had spent, 26 years getting into investment banking. I'd spent, the next 22 years as an investment banker. And it was a job I loved. But I'd reached a point where I said, I feel stagnant. I'm not growing. I'm not growing as a person. I'm not growing in my job. I'm not really helping this business. It's probably time to rethink what I'm doing. And that was really, really a tough decision. Again, you can never control all the circumstances. And it was almost sort of coincidental. It was coincidental that, right at the time when I'm really sort of mired the most in this decision, I received a couple of phone calls from executive search firms who were looking to fill jobs at two different insurance companies, in jobs that, again, as I thought about what would I do next, that was exactly what I would do next. So, you know, somebody greater than me had a plan for me, but it was just, you know, at that critical time where I said, I really need to make this decision, you know, kick myself and just go, and the door opened basically to do it. So that, again, that was probably the toughest decision I had to make. The other, if I go back real early in my career, you know, I mentioned about being prepared for the unexpected. You know, this was only 3 years into my career, and I was loving my job, doing what we're doing. There was a huge incident at the firm I was working with. Basically, we had a trader, a mortgage trader, who blew up the firm, essentially. You know, destroyed all the quarterly earnings, et cetera. And of course, the firm did a big reorganization. My boss came to me and said, "Okay, here's how we're reorganizing. You know, I want to take all of us and go over to this group." And then the other, his boss came to me and said, "Steve, you're great. We'd love to have you. We want you to stay here. We're going to do this with you." So, you know, torn right then too about how do I make that decision. And that was one where, you know, I really had to, at a kind of a young age, kind of piece together as much information and outlook as I could for how a business would evolve. And so again, you know, I took together as much as I could. I sounded out, you know, my network of people that understood enough about the business for it, and then, you know, and then ultimately did make the decision. But that was one where I really felt pressured and unequipped to have to make this. You know, at the time I thought this was a career-making decision. Of course, you know, 3 years later everything changed again. But it's just how you evaluate things at that point in time, and making sure you give yourself, you know, the tools in order to do so.
Yeah, some of your advice from the beginning of your talk, I think you covered that. Being open, flexible, establishing your network, all of that you just addressed. And then what would you say was most fulfilling in your career so far?
In my career so far, you know, what I'd have to say is actually sort of the recent past, and it's something that we did when, you know, I became Chief Investment Officer in 2011. And a year later, we had a new CEO, and as is typical, you know, a new CEO likes to undertake a strategic review, figure out where he wants to take the firm. And one of the things we decided was we wanted to start an asset management business, you know, third-party asset management business. You know, we laid out a game plan. I took it to him. We discussed it. We discussed it among the leadership team of MetLife. There were a lot of, you know, people who were against it, people who thought we couldn't do it. Ultimately, I got approval to start it, and in, you know, in 7 years, we've built it to where we now manage $150 billion of assets for third-party clients, in addition to the, you know, almost $500 billion that we manage for MetLife. And so it's been a great success. It's been a challenge all the way along, you know, growing a business from scratch. Not entirely from scratch, because we had MetLife behind us and the general account, but this third-party business from scratch has been eminently rewarding. And, you know, and the best part of it is watching it grow and bringing more people in to grow it as well. And it's been a great mix of having to hire people from outside MetLife that had brought skills and capabilities that we didn't have, to continuing to utilize the skills and capabilities that we already had. I mean, that's been it's been a very rewarding business experience, no question.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And next up, Andre, class of 20.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for talking to us.
Hi, Andre.
So it's going to be kind of a weird question, but I really wanted to get your perspective on it. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but in psychology, there's an effect called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which basically says that when you discover a new field, people basically tend to overestimate their capacities and their abilities in this field. But as they kind of discover the complexity of the field and they study more about it, they kind of understand that they are not as competent as they thought before. So you mentioned the idea of being, you know, curious and kind of touch many fields, being versatile. And I wanted to know, how do you know that you have mastered a skill, that you really have become better than most other people? Is it based on how much time you've put on it? Do you kind of evaluate, your results, or so how do you go about that?
So first of all, I say I must have the Dunning-Kruger effect, because I never felt that I was a master of a job that I had just come into. And in fact, I look today, the day that I think I've mastered it and I know more than everybody else, I'm done. I'm gone. I come to this job every day expecting to learn from the people around me, expecting to see a new challenge, expecting to have to figure out something that I haven't had to figure out before. But being confident that with the people I surround myself with the thought process and decision making that I go through, we'll figure out the best answer. So I think that's critical. Hopefully this has come out, but I think a trait that's critical as a leader, to be a successful leader in this, is humility. I talked about realizing what you don't know, but being able to sort of express that. So I really believe that the day that I come in here and think that I've mastered it all is the day that I'll be replaced.
That makes sense.
I'm sorry, you're on mute.
But you're still confident. You're still confident about. So my question, I guess, is more, and it also relates to athletics. As far as particular skills for football, like how do you know that you've reached that level that you were shooting for?
Yeah. Well, football is probably a little easier. An athletic endeavor may be a little bit easier, because at least there, you're always tested, man on man. How did you do in the game? Did you outperform the person that you were playing against? Did you outperform as a team against it? So that actually, you probably do get better feedback on that. Now, but just because it was good enough one day doesn't mean it's good enough the next day. So that's why I think you always have to keep striving and be open to what can improve you, as a person, as a manager, as a leader, as an athlete.
Thank you. Terrific.
Thanks.
Okay, excellent. And with that, let's turn it over to our president, Christopher Callahan.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We appreciate that. Before we wrap up, I see my friend Tim Carroll, the great dean of the Eberhard School of Business. I was wondering if Dean Carroll could jump on and to see if he might have a question for our guest.
Well, thank you. Good to see you again, Steve.
Hey,
last time you and I spoke was pre-COVID in that different world. And I remember that one of the comments you made, we were talking about the risk of a recession, because that was something getting talked about in the financial markets. And you said, I think the biggest risk of a recession is us talking ourselves into a recession. I think the fundamentals are not the problem. How do you see things now? Are the fundamentals still good? They're still there? Or given everything that's gone on, do you see the economy and the path forward very differently?
Yeah. It's certainly the world is different. And this is something that I think when we assessed it, certainly at the time we talked, we wouldn't have looked to something like this. We were really concentrated on just kind of, economic fundamentals, what was happening across different sectors, what was happening in markets, what did sort of capital flows in general look like. I remember, talking with our investment committee of the board back in January, and we, with all of our chief market strategists, we were, sort of laying out our outlook. And not dissimilar, we said still the biggest issue that, the fundamentals are okay, are not bad, but, you look at CEO confidence, which was going down. You look at capital spending, which was going down. And you still sort of got this view that, gee, are we talking ourselves into a recession? So we had a view that we were going to see a recession, and of course this is January. So remember, the COVID had started in China, and it was a matter of what was going to happen, how long would it take to get here. It was definitely coming, And what we said, and the investment committee specifically asked us and said, well, what happens if COVID hits? And we said, really sort of three effects. Number one is the recession hits sooner, the recession becomes broader, and the recession becomes deeper, which is exactly what happened over the course of the next 4 months. But what we've all, in this field, what we've all tried to figure out is, how does the recovery look like? Because this is very unlike what we went through in 2008 and 2009 with the great financial crisis. This is caused by an entirely non-financial, non-economic incident. And so you just think through it. You have to try and think through it differently. Overnight, half of Wall Street has become infectious disease experts. But you do have to learn and try and figure out as much as you can. So we've seen exactly what we expected, which was a strong recovery. There still are debates on what's going to happen with this recovery. Obviously, this has been a terrible week in the market because of, again, what do markets do, right? The markets just process information and make assessments about the future direction economically of financial instruments. And that's where we are today again, is there's more uncertainty now than we had 3 weeks ago. Is this rebound going to be as bad in the United States as we're seeing in Europe? Could it be worse? And what's that going to mean to the overall economy? Are we going to face shutdowns again? And then put on top of it also just uncertainty about where we are politically. We've got a big election coming up next week. I think everyone is also trying to assess how will these markets behave if it's a week, 2 weeks, 6 weeks before we actually know the outcome of the election. That's going to be a lot of uncertainty. Markets don't behave well in times of uncertainty. So the market has a lot to really sort of digest. Now, the thing we know and what we saw, immediately in March and into April was, the central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, are really poised and ready to assist and support the markets however they can. And to be honest, our view is that's actually where a lot of the strength has come from, not just fundamentals alone, but also basically the confidence and support that the central banks will continue to provide to markets. I mean, everybody wants to see markets functioning properly, and they certainly have signaled that they're going to be there to do that. So anyway, that's kind of our assessment is we've had a nice recovery. It hasn't been a full recovery because it can't yet pull along all the sectors that have been hit hardest by COVID. But we clearly have seen it rebound in the sectors where we have seen it. And remember, markets are also looking longer term. And that's where a lot of us certainly still get our confidence that we will figure, as a country, as a nation, as really a world, we'll figure out a solution or remedy for this. And then we'll, ultimately get back to how do we continue to grow our economies? How do we work, across the globe to continue to grow too? But uncertainty in this time period is certainly not unexpected.
Thanks, Steve. You've seen enough recessions, you've seen enough downturns followed by the upturns to have that long-term confidence. I think it's a good message for our students and alums on the call. Bad times don't last. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, we have to kick ourselves too and keep reminding us of that. Yeah, hey, we've been through worse things, and we'll get through this. It's tough right now while we're doing it, but we will ultimately get through this too.
Steve,
Thanks,
I feel like the hour just flew by. We can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us today, to take time from your very, very busy schedule. This has been a real treat for all of us to hear from one of our great alums. If I may, just to wrap up before we let you go, one final question. As the university heads into the final stretch of our Leading with Purpose campaign, it is more important than ever for all of us to remember what guides us. So if you could, Steve, this is a hard assignment. if you could, in one sentence, can you tell us what is your purpose?
Yeah, there are a number of ways of answering that, but I think the simplest way to think about it, and this is, this isn't what I would have said 25 years ago. There's no doubt about it. But, I really feel now that I've been so fortunate to be where I am, to get to where I am. And like I said, it wasn't all me. Somebody had a plan for me. I think God had a plan for me. But my goal now, my purpose, I feel, is really to ensure that when I'm gone from here, that I've done what I can to make this world a better place. And that might mean helping out Pacific. That might mean helping out, the poor and indigent here in Paterson, New Jersey. There are a lot of ways to do it, but I can do it. One thing I remember hearing this several years ago from a good friend, a business friend who had retired to me, and he said, Steve, I think about my life in 3 stages. It's learn, it's earn, and it's return. And I always thought, wow, that's the smartest guy I've ever met. Then I realized he didn't create that. He read it somewhere else. But anyway, I do think that is critical. I spent the first third of my life learning. I spent the next third of my life earning, and I want to spend the next third of my life returning.
A marvelous, marvelous frame. Steve, again, thank you for a wonderful session. And we're looking forward to welcoming you and Christy back to campus in person sometime soon when conditions allow.
Great.
But in the meantime, thank you so much. Stay safe, stay well.
Thanks.
And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.